Pardon me, but do you have gear acquisition syndrome? You know, that whirlwind of compulsive desire to acquire more and more and more gear. Or you simply won't be able to do whatever it is you're trying to do, even though most of the time, actually, as a matter of fact, you don't really need it. Gas affects all sorts of people, from guitarists to recording engineers to photographers to gamers and gearheads and bicyclists. And here, pulling from the science of habit formation and from my own experience, I want to share 5 tips for overcoming gas, as well as one challenge that I think you can do to really kick gas in the ass. So what exactly is gas, and how do you know if you have it? Well, I think it's pretty simple. You have gas if you at all put the means to some goal over the achievement of that goal itself. So some people set out to be creatives and then they end up mere collectors, because the time that they would have spent practicing and learning their craft, they instead put into learning about the greatest new gear out there for doing the thing. We can take a page here from big tech companies like Apple and Alphabet. They typically set aside about 10 to 15% of their budget for R&D. Now, roughly speaking, if you are putting way more than 10% or 15% of your total creative time and effort and energy into thinking about gear and not into thinking about what you're going to use that gear for, then you're probably suffering from gas. So what can you actually do about it? Tip number 1, prioritize maintenance over replacement. I've had this Stratocaster since I was 17, and I've always loved this guitar. It was the guitar that I largely learned how to play on. It just feels like home. It's just such a great guitar. The neck is like perfect for me. And for a long time though, I set this thing aside and I just really didn't play it very much. And I started gravitating toward all sorts of other guitars. And at one point I was even thinking about buying another Strat style guitar that I definitely don't need, because I really have that bass covered. And I realized that the reason I was doing that was because every time I went to go use this thing, especially for recording, I realized that when I would play a chord down low on the neck or something, it just didn't sound right. It just didn't sound good. And I actually have a background in gear maintenance. I was a guitar tech and instrument tech for a band on the road for a couple years. I know how to set up a guitar, but it didn't matter what I did to this thing. It just didn't seem to play in tune. It didn't seem to work for me when I was recording. So I got to the point where I just decided, hey, let me bring this to someone whose full-time job is working on instruments and see what he can do with it. So I did that, and he, within a few minutes, figured out that actually the problem wasn't anything I was doing with the setup. It was actually that at the factory, they put some extra metal shims under this nut here, and those shims were basically raising the nut up too high and causing the lower frets here to be out of tune. So he did a full setup on this thing, and you know what? I got it back. It plays and sounds better than it ever has, and I'm playing this thing and loving it once again. It was a simple $60 setup, put some new strings on it, all the works, and now I love it. Chances are that if you've got decent gear that's just not well maintained, your money will go a lot further just maintaining and maybe modifying what you have than it would if you start trying to replace it. So start there. Tip number 2, invest in your skills instead of your setup. Most of the time we think that we need some new piece of gear to inspire us, to pull some new thing out of us, when in fact what we really need is to learn more about our craft, whether it's guitar playing, photography, videography, what have you. So instead of buying a new guitar or a new pedal or something, buy a course. Get lessons from a teacher, somebody that knows what you're trying to do incredibly well and can help pull you out of whatever rut you're in way better than some new piece of gear will do. I just bought courses from Rick Beato, from Rhett Schull, from Dylan Adams, and I know from doing this kind of thing in the past that when I dive into educating myself and increasing my skills, every aspect of my playing, of my craft, and the fun that I get from it rises in a way that just doesn't happen or doesn't happen long term when I buy a new guitar or a new amp or something. Typically when we buy a new piece of gear, we simply do the stuff that we used to do with that piece of gear, and a lot of times we lose even more time because we spend all this time like comparing what we used to have to what we have now to figure out if it's really any better. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes really what you're doing is you're getting rid of some problems, but you're adding new ones, and now you have new things to research and deal with and new equipment that you want to buy to deal with those problems. Set all that aside and invest in your skills instead of your setup. Tip number 3, replace the gas line with inspiration on tap. I don't know about you, but for me, for years, I've been bombarded with these finely tuned marketing messages trying to sell me on all the things that I really actually, at the end of the day, don't need. Emails, marketing emails, the stupid deal of the day from Musician's Friend, reverb, weekly feeds and push notifications, red little icons on the Facebook Marketplace app that tell me all of the new things that have been listed that I might be interested in. All of these things are cues for certain habits. And what we need to do is replace those cues with healthy ones, cues that incite us to go do the things that we actually want to do and that we know we will get the most out of doing. One of the big difficulties, of course, for guitar players is that our source of positive motivation and inspiration is pretty well tied up with our source of gear lust. We see Tom Bukovac or Chris Buck or Jack Griffiths playing this incredible stuff, and at the same time, we see them playing it with a certain piece of gear, and we kind of get it in our heads that, well, we need that same piece of gear to do anything even nearly as cool as what they're doing. But actually, most of the time, we don't. We could pretty well mimic what it is they're doing, if not perfectly, very closely with the gear that we already have. And most of us have way more gear than we actually need. Plus, take into account the fact that tone is entirely contextual. You hear great guitar players like Julian Lodge, for instance, saying that there's no such thing as a bad guitar tone.
No sound is empirically good or bad. It's just kind of how it fits into the narrative, right?
Tone is entirely contextual. So what can we do to turn that gas line into inspiration on tap? Well, instead of focusing on great tone and the tools that create it, we should instead focus on what is happening musically that is capturing our attention. What cool chord voicings or rhythmic patterns or picking patterns are making the music that we're hearing so cool? Why is it that it captures our ear, musically speaking? One thing that can help with this, if you find it really difficult to focus on the music and not on what is making the gear that is used in making that music, try listening more with your ears and less with your eyes, so to speak. Like, if you need to, turn the computer screen or iPhone or iPad, turn it away from you and just listen to what's happening musically and think about what the melody is and what makes that melody so interesting, or if it goes in the same direction that you would take it, how would you do something different with that melody? Along the same lines, you can follow musicians or artists who do something entirely different than you. So a pianist for me, or a saxophone player. I can take musical inspiration, and in fact, there's probably more for me to pull from somebody who plays an entirely different instrument, because there are all these things that would be really interesting to try to mimic on my instrument. I can probably pull more in the way of inspiration from somebody who's playing a different instrument than me than someone who's playing the same instrument. Plus, if I hear somebody playing this really cool piano part, it's probably not going to motivate me to go out and buy some new guitar amp, right? Maybe a pedal or something to get a certain tone, but unlikely I'm going to have that urge to go out and buy gear to solve some musical problem. I'll probably just focus on the gear that I have and creating great music with it instead. Tip number 4, don't fight imaginary dragons. A lot of times we get this idea into our heads that we're going to face some situation in the future and we're going to need some piece of gear. And we project these goals and these problems that we're going to have that we've never actually experienced. And then we proactively go and try to address that problem. We're squirreling away gear for this far off possibility that we may or may not ever face. In the immortal words of Sherlock Holmes, it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. And we make that mistake when we try to project into the future some problem that we're going to have, but we've never actually experienced. And almost every time that I've faced this, for instance, I joined this band and I had some ideas about, okay, I'm going to need this kind of guitar and this kind of amp and maybe this sort of stuff on my pedal board. I joined and it turned out that the stuff I thought I was going to need would have been not at all what I would actually need. Projecting needs that you've never actually experienced almost always leads to you buying more gear or perhaps less than ideal gear for the problem that you will actually face. So my theory on this, or my view on this, is that you should go out into the field and experience the problem for yourself. Maybe even live with that problem for a little bit. Get a really good feel for what exactly it is, what it feels like, and what a good solution will be. Because 9 times out of 10, if you try to solve a problem that you've never experienced for yourself, your solution is going to be way off the mark. Number 5, and perhaps the most important one, redefine yourself as a creative problem solver, not as a collector. One of the most insane yet inspiring things I've ever seen is Alex Honnold free soloing, what was it, El Capitan in the documentary Free Solo. Free solo means climbing a rock face with basically no gear, just shoes and climbing chalk. Whereas other people would obviously need to go up with ropes and all sorts of safety devices, Alex Honnold climbed this thing with basically no gear. And there's a parallel here. Mastery is getting to that point where you can rely on yourself and your technique instead of having to rely on all of this gear. Amateurs default to thinking they need the right tools for any given situation, whereas masters realize that they need the right technique. Now, this isn't to say that masters don't rely on gear or that they shouldn't. I mean, definitely not telling you to go out and climb El Capitan without gear, right? The point is that masters, although they might use the gear, actually don't need it. Maybe a great guitar player like Tom Bukovac has a massive pedal board that helps him get sounds on demand in the studio. He could do the same thing though with less gear. It would just take more time. He wouldn't be able to do it as quickly. And of course, if you're in the studio, time is money. The clock is ticking and you want to get the sounds you need very, very fast. So the point though is that if you put a master and an amateur in that same situation, the master is going to figure out how to do what he needs to do using his technique. The amateur will be convinced that he can't do it without certain gear, and perhaps he can't because he hasn't worked on his technique enough. When you face some problem that you think only gear can solve, step back and ask yourself, well, using what I have, starting where I am and using what I have, what can I do, to paraphrase Arthur Ashe, right? Embrace creative constraints. If you're convinced that you need a Les Paul to nail some specific tone, before you go out and buy a Les Paul, get your Telecaster or get your HSS Strat or whatever and figure out how to EQ your amp just right, or how to pick just right, or all of these things combined. Come up with some means of using the gear you have to get as close as you possibly can to whatever it is you're trying to do. Maybe it will be nowhere close, but I bet you'll learn a lot in the process. So those are my 5 tips for getting over gear acquisition syndrome. Prioritize maintenance over replacement, skills over your setup, replace the gas line with inspiration on tap, don't fight imaginary dragons, and redefine yourself as a creative problem solver, not as a collector. Now for the challenge. For the next 6 months, I'm not going to buy, trade, or otherwise acquire any gear, and I invite you guys to come along with me for the journey. Let's focus on our craft. Let's focus on the reason that we got into this stuff in the first place. Focus on technique and getting better, and not focus on gear. Instead, let's do these 5 things and let's see where we get. Let's see how far we can go toward our actual legitimate artistic goals instead of the stuff that sucks our time and creativity. Let me know in the comments below what you're passionate about, whether or not you're going to take this challenge on, or what you think about it, any other tips that you have for getting over gear acquisition syndrome. And if you want to show me you care, like, subscribe, and share.